So, hi, I'm going to be maybe 45 minutes and then have a few questions if you have any. So a few words about myself, maybe to get started. My name is Arthur Schmidt. I'm an engineer and industrial designer. I studied at ENSAM, so École des Arts et Métiers in France, and Royal College of Art in London. That was years ago, obviously. And since then, I've been working in what we could call collaborative prototyping, basically. So how you can animate a team during a short periods or longer periods so that they come up with an idea and then find a way to make it tangible. So, well, I could tell you more about it later if you're interested, if you ask about it. I'm here to tell you about the cathedral and the bazaar. It's the title of my presentation is a reference to a book from Eric Raymond from the middle of the 90s, so last century. Not sure you were even born. But it was basically the beginning of the internet, and this book chronicles two different ways of building software, and it kind of analyzes the very beginning of the open source movement. And so I thought it was interesting to look back at its at what Eric Raymond had written with what we've learned since then, basically, about the internet, and open it a bit more, rather than just talk about open source, try and see it under the prism of projects, and more specifically, open projects. So that's what I'm going to be telling you about today. So this is the place where I work in the south of France. It's called the camp. So obviously this is like a 3D rendering of what the place was supposed to be, or what it was meant to be. And that's we've opened a year and a half ago, so September 2017, and since then I've been wondering a lot about how people use the space and what they feel allowed to do, not to do, and so on. And that's the beginning of what made me wonder about what made me look back basically at the cathedral and the bazaar, because at the end I think it's all revolves around a very central question, well, at least for us at the camp, which is, are we in a space that is finished, that has been built, or are we in a space that is continually, that is never finished, that is always being built? And that's one of the premises of the cathedral and the bazaar. So before we get started, I've been talking about bazaar. It's a word that can have basically like a strong meaning, especially in French. When we talk about bazaar, it's synonymous with bordel, messy, and so on. Chaos. That's not what I'm talking about. What I'm referring to is the bazaar as in more like a marketplace. And this is what the cathedral and the bazaar are referring to. On the left is a view of a cathedral. So a cathedral project is a project built where everything is planned years in advance. and then all the roles are defined towards this objective in a very organized and pyramidal way. And on the right-hand side is the bazaar, which is more like the marketplace, which is never finished, which has very few rules and so on. I'm going to talk about it later, obviously, because that's what the presentation is about. But just so you remember, when I'm talking about bazaar, I'm not talking about chaos. Okay. One thing that you have to remember as well is that free beer is different from free speech. So I'm guessing some of you know about free beer. You might have had a few too many yesterday, for example. But do you know about free speech? In French, we have two different words for it. So we have libre et gratuit. So gratuit as in free, as in you don't have to pay for it, and libre and as in free, as in open, which is what I'm talking about today. That's the main focus. But open source, libre, basically means you can open the hood, basically, look inside, find out how it was built, and then maybe make modifications that you want, and maybe bring in some other parts and so on. But it's different from being free. So not everything that is open source is free, and not everything that is free is open source. As an example, I've just put here a screenshot of the Tesla website. So you might have heard about Tesla, electric car manufacturer. Elon Musk, it's well-known CEO. So this is a screen cap from 2014, when they decided to open source all of Tesla's patents, their brevet, it's called in French. So obviously this doesn't make Teslas free, but it makes part of them open source, okay? And that means, that's going to be my main point, my point later, but open source is not something that is underground. It's, if Tesla is using it, you might think that it makes business sense, okay? Because I think Elon Musk knows one or two things about business, I believe. And for them, the idea is really to aggregate a community and ecosystem around their product, because what they believe is that if more people use their designs, it makes them basically more resilient, more powerful. So open source is an underground. This is a graph of contributors to GitHub, which is basically like a code sharing platform. And what you see on the right, top right, are two major contributors, so Microsoft and Google. And basically, they all contribute to a lot of projects, a lot of open source projects, and and share a lot of what they do. Google has contributes to more than 2,000 different projects, I think. But Microsoft has more contributors to open source projects, which I don't know if you see the difference, but whatever, you could even argue, if you force the argument, you could even say that companies that make it today are companies that use open source, basically. Okay, it's not underground. It's not two guys in their basement. Most, I would say, like 90% of the web today runs thanks to open source projects. So it's all very serious. And if you want to succeed, basically, you're going to have to learn when to use open source projects and how to contribute to them. So this last point might, I don't know, look logical. But I've had people argue the opposite, but it's always important to remember that when you're in an organization, there's always going to be more intelligence outside the organization than inside the organization. And so part of your role as an organization could be to actually find ways to harness this intelligence outside your organization. This can be done through very simple, in various ways, and some of them obviously don't have to be open source or whatever. So this is an example of Lego Ideas, which is basically a crowdsourcing website made by Lego. So the idea from Lego is to be like, okay, people like our product, they invent Lego kits in their basement, so how can we harness that power? And so they made a website where people can share their ideas, show pictures of what they built, and if other people like it, they decide if it can be turned into a kit, and then they put it onto the market. And there has been some really interesting kits coming out in the last few years, and a lot of engagement built around this website. It's also interesting that they started it as a very simple test only in Japan at the beginning, and because it succeeded, they made it a worldwide project. So once again, this is Lego finding ways to harness the power of their community, looking for people who they couldn't hire anyway, because obviously you can't hire everyone in your company, but also some people might live very far or have another job that they like. They might not be interested in joining the companies, but they might be interested in finding ways to contribute somehow. So what I'm going to be talking about when I talk about the bazaar, like I said, it started in the mid-90s. So it has inspired a lot of different branches or projects or concepts. So I'm going to be stepping over like a lot of different things, and so I'm going to be talking about open source, obviously, but also what we call entreprise libérée, agile methodologies, lean startup, design thinking, collective intelligence, peer-to-peer, maker movement. So the bazaar can find a lot of different ways to be put into action, and this can be seen in all these different concepts. So let's get into it. For me, these are two very good examples of the cathedral on one side, so Disneyland, and the bazaar on the other side, which is Burning Man. Burning Man is a festival in the Nevada desert. It happens in August every year, and basically it's like a temporary city is built in the desert. 50,000 people come on the same place, and they just make art and party and whatever else they do. But what I think is interesting is when you put those two images next to each other, is that if you think on a very meta level, basically you could say that they have the same mission, okay? Both of them want their visitors to have like the best experience of their life, okay? And the only thing is that they find very different ways for doing that. So I'm going to get into more detail about how this takes shape. But these are, for me, the two extremes. I'm putting, it seems very black and white when I put them next to each other. One of them is good, one of them is bad, and so on. But that's really not my point. I'm just trying to see, I'm trying to show two extremes. And obviously I favor the bazaar personally, but I think there's a very gray area in between. And I think my argument when I talk about that with companies is that organizations that manage to that are successful today are the ones that manage to basically find the right balance between the cathedral and the bazaar. And they manage to be, sometimes they manage to be the cathedral and sometimes the bazaar, and they alternate between those two states. And that's this balance that makes them powerful. So I've just lined up a few words that are usually attributed to one or the other. Once again, it seems very black and white, but it's just to try and make sure you understand what I'm talking about. I'm not going to go through them right now. You can read them. You're also going to have access to my presentation. I'm going to give you the link later. So what does a bazaar look like in practice? That's the main focus of my presentation. The first point, I think, is around the notion of mission, and something that is that has to be really crystal clear. One of the examples that I like, one of the best examples for me of the bazaar is Wikipedia. So Wikipedia is an online encyclopedia. I'm pretty sure you've used it before, but some of you might not know that it's actually written by contributors who do it on their free time and make every article better one after the other. So it's obviously some kind of big bazaar, because it's using the community, harnessing the power of the community to make itself better. But what I find really interesting is that its mission, if you had to put it into words, is basically to manage to put together in one place all of human knowledge, okay? So this can seem like an impossible task, and obviously it is an impossible task. There is no point when people are going to be like shaking hands and patting each other on the back and be like, okay, well done, we've well deserved our beer now, and we can get to another project. So most bazaars share this very forward-looking mission, and this is also how they create desire, basically, how people find want to join the project and find ways to help to contribute to the project. And a lot of companies are now starting to write these mission statements that are very bold and very forward-looking, but it also has to take root in like real life and what the company or the organization actually does. So make organizational boundaries porous. So that means in a real company, in a real organization, it's very clear who's in and who's out. In the bazaar, this is this line is a lot more blurry, and one of the, well, because you're trying to harness the power of the community, it means you need to find ways for them to come into the organization. It means when you meet someone, it's not very clear if he's in the organization or not. I'm going to give an example of community that's called DIY Drones. What I find interesting is that this community is actually run by a company behind that is called 3D Robotics, which sells drones and all kind of well, mostly drones systems. And what's interesting is that they use the inventions of the community, the feedback of the community, to make their drones better. And then there's a really a feedback loop, basically, between the community and the company. So this goes with the porous boundaries, but it means in your organization, whatever it is, you need to try and find ways to encourage initiatives and minimize friction for people who want to contribute. Just to show that it isn't only for open source projects or whatever. This is an example from the Valve employee handbook. So I'm not sure if you're familiar with Valve, but it's a software company based in the US. They're famous for basically starting the Half-Life video games and the Steam game game streaming platform. And so they're one of the most successful company in the US in terms of money they make per employee. And they have this handbook that they give away to new employees that is really very interesting, and I invite you to actually read it in its entirety, because it's a very good example of Bazaar also for me. But in it, they have this sentence, which is, we've heard that other companies have people allocate a percentage of their time to self-directed projects. At Valve, that percentage is 100%, is 100. So basically, what it means is that once people are hired in the company, they can work on whatever they want, okay? So this is really one of the best ways to actually encourage initiative. If you're interested in how that actually works, once again, I invite you to have a read through their handbook. There's the link is on my presentation. This is another example of less business-oriented, but more community-oriented. This is an example of a kit, basically, that allows every citizen to contribute to open data about weather and sound and pollution and in their environment. And so they can buy a kit and then put it on their windowsill or whatever, and then contribute to the data pool that people are then can then use for whatever they want. And so this has a lot of different ways for citizens to actually get engaged. They can, the first step is just, okay, they can buy a kit. Then the next step is they can contribute to make the kit better if they know about DIY electronics and so on. And then they can also work on how to analyze all the data that has been created. So there's a lot of different ways for people to get involved. I've also added just an example that I think is funny, which is, so this is a screen cap from Kickstarter of a project called Exploding Kittens. It's, well, I'm not going to get into what the game is about, but it's basically about exploding kittens. But what I invite you to do is look at the number of comments at the bottom. Basically, I've never seen another project with 100,000 comments, and it's basically because they've managed to create a lot of engagement around their project during the campaign. And one way they did that is not only to use the extended goals or whatever is usually used with crowdfunding projects, but they've also added ways for people to actually get engaged with or without supporting the project. So, for example, they said, okay, if you want to have a new card in the game with Batman on it, we need to see, we need to receive 5 pictures on Twitter of people dressed as Batman in a bathtub over the weekend. And so that means people were actually calling their friends, be like, oh, I've got a disguise, oh, and I've got a bathtub, okay, let's do the picture, and blah, blah, blah. And so this also brought in new people who supported the project. So there was a really interesting snowball effect and engagement effect. So this is some kind of scale that I use when I try and design a project. I try and imagine how each contributor can use it and contribute to it. So the first one, obviously, observation is a very simple one. Is okay, I see someone doing something, I find out that this project or this concept exists, I hear about it, whatever. This is more about communication, mediation, and so on. So participation is really your, I would say, your standard user. He finds out he likes the product and or the project or whatever, and he uses it. But he's still in a some kind of like a consumption mindset, okay? And that's when it actually starts to shift, and you have a contributor that is out basically of the consumption mindset, and he starts to turn into someone who's active on the project. So it means he can actually help others, help new users, give feedback. There's a lot of different ways for people to contribute on different projects. And the next one that I've called activation is actually someone who takes a very active role and who can help all the other steps get to the next step, basically. And so when you build a new project, I invite you to think about each of these steps, and also think about how each one can get to the next level. What can make them get to the next step? So turn governance around those who make. So I'm not sure what if you're familiar with what governance means, but it's basically we call governance the way people are organized. So if you're in a project team and there's 5 of you, then you have to find ways, well, basically to make decisions. So how are you going to do it? Are you going to vote, and then what is it? Is it the majority, or do you have to reach a consensus on the project? Do you actually have to convince each other until everyone actually supports the decision that has been made? So that's what we call governance. It's all these rules of how people interact with each other. And in those Bazaar projects, what I find really interesting is how governance is always very close to people who actually make. If we take the example of the cathedral, usually it's people at the very top who make the decisions, and they're very far from people who actually make. Okay, so when the people at the bottom actually find a problem, the problem has to go all the way back up until someone makes a decision, and then the decision comes down and is actually put into practice. But maybe the people at the top don't have all the correct information or the correct knowledge to make that decision. What we find in bazaars is that usually they try and connect those two very close to each other. So decision very close to people who actually act and who know the terrain, we could call it. So Spotify is another very interesting example of a company that actually makes money and so on, but who has a way of organization inside that is very close to a bazaar. Once again, I invite you to have a read on those links. Spotify is organized in small squads. So a squad is around, I think, 6 to 8 people. So it's basically like a team. But what it says is that each of these teams has enough knowledge and everything to basically make decisions on their own on what they make. Okay. And it's something we see more and more is actually company directors being proud of how little decisions they make, and this shows basically that their companies is well organized. This is just a picture of a meeting at Free Space, which is an open project in San Francisco. But one thing that maybe I'll get to it later, but I think that you have to remember is that all this governance, organization, and so on, which is very close to actually how a democracy or a community works, actually takes time, and that we have to learn or relearn how to spend this time getting organized and sharing ideas, reaching consensus, and so on. So set your own rules. This is an example of a project that is called Recurse. It's basically a hacker residency in New York City. This is a screen cap of their page on their website that is called Recurse Manual. So it's basically a user manual for the space, so how people can use the space. Once again, I invite you to go have a look at it. It's very thorough, very rich, and very interesting. I've just taken this screen cap of those 4 rules because I think it's very interesting how, in the end, the rules that you share as a community, as an organization, whatever, it really ends up defining your DNA and your culture, and then how people interact with each other. So those 4 rules are very well analyzed and described on their website. I'm going to try and go through them very quickly. The first one is no feigning surprise. So it means when someone asks you a question, you're not allowed to basically pretend that you're surprised and be like, "Oh, you don't know that. How come you don't know that?" Because it diminishes the person on the other side. And what it means is that they actually want to encourage people to ask questions to each other, and if one of them starts diminishing the other is not going to ask as many questions. No well actuallys. Once again, this is all around how you handle questions and answers between people. But know what actually is means when someone explains something, sorry, you're not allowed to finish and add something to what he's saying that is just tiny, and then to correct him and be like, well, actually, it's not quite right, you see, because I know a bit more than you do, and so on. So once again, this is all around how you define interactions, when how to encourage people asking questions to each other in a positive way. No backseat driving, so that means when you hear two people trying to solve a problem on a computer, you can't be on the other side of the room and be like, oh, have you tried that? Have you tried that? It means you're either trying to solve the problem or you're minding your own business. And no subtleisms, obviously, so that means there is absolutely no space for the tiniest hint or drop of racism, sexism, and so on. Make everything transparent. So this is a quote that is actually from the book The Cathedral and the Bazaar, written by Eric Raymond. And so it says, given enough eyeballs, all bugs are shallow. So it means when you put your, when you share what you've done and you put it out there on the web, all its bugs are going to disappear, basically. So the more people look at something, the more people have access to something, the less bug it has. And I think this has really been confirmed over the years, and today some of the very safe or very projects that needs a lot of security actually uses open source projects, because it means when people can read through it, then they can find bugs and they can help make it better. And so it means projects that are open source are, not all of them obviously, but projects that are open source and that are used by a lot of people are actually safer than closed source projects. Yeah, this can become, this can be applied to a lot of different things. And one example is at Buffer, which is a company in the US, and they're taking transparency very seriously, and they think salaries is one of the things that actually make interactions with people within a company complicated. When they suspect or they hear someone makes more than them or whatever, it complicates the interactions in the company. And so they've decided to make all of their salaries open and transparent. So they're using, once again, you can click on the link and it's gonna, you're gonna be able to read all about it. It's very well described, and they explain why they do it and how they do it. And so they have a calculation, and you can actually enter your parameters and find out how much you'd be paid if you worked at Buffer. But so transparency, obviously there's a very fine granularity. There's a lot of things that can be shared or cannot or whatever. It's on you to decide where to go, but some of the bazaars are well, take transparency very seriously, and some organizations actually prevent people from meeting face to face, because when it's face to face, it means there's no trace of it, and it's as if it never happened, because they want to be able to. When a decision has been made, they want to be able to read back and be like, oh, this is why, and how this choice was made, and so on. And So transparency is a very interesting point to dig into. This is an example of, so this is a GitHub page. So like I was saying, GitHub is a code sharing platform. And this is the page for Bootstrap. Bootstrap is a web framework that is developed by Twitter, but used by like millions of people around the world. And this is the issues page on the GitHub project. So sorry if that's a lot of jargon, but basically what it means is this is the place where people who use the product actually complain about the product or actually raise problems that they've had using the product. So they're saying, oh, it doesn't work on iOS or whatever. And so this, you can see there is 250 open issues, and anyone can raise a new issue, but it also means making all those issues public. It means they have to actually make it better, and it means that people who want to contribute can actually find one of these issues and code the solution for it, publish the solution, and then all the issue has been solved, and the project is made better. So I always well, I find it very inspiring, and I always wonder what it would be like if Renault or Peugeot or whatever, Danone had a page where people could actually raise problems with the way they use the product and on how to make the product better. So favor systems over products. Basically, if you want to run an open project, it's always more interesting to think about the system than to think about the product. This is the example of Arduino. Arduino has been around for maybe something like 10 years. Yeah, I remember when it came out, and I was at school in London. It's basically a little computer, so you're going to have to interact with it. You might have already interacted with it. So it's basically a small computer that is very easy to program, and that allows you to make interactive projects. So saying, here is a sensor, there is some computing happening, boom, here is an activator, something happens. When it came out, it was really new, and it could have been made into like a closed source project, but they decided to make it open source, and they decided to publish the schematics, the way it was built. And if you look at it, there's the main schematics haven't changed for 10 years, and that means people can, well, other companies, other organizations, whoever, can actually build shields, what it's called shields, but things that can make the product better. So they can add an accelerometer, some other sensors, screen, buttons, whatever. But that means they can use like a Lego brick, basically. They can use the connectors and make their own. And so it means there's a very rich ecosystem around Arduino of different companies that build complements on it that use the same base. So I think this is a very good example of a system rather than a product, and that actually managed to gather an ecosystem around it. So obviously, another very good example of a system is Lego, and the bricks that come out today are still compatible with the first bricks that came out in the 1960s. So and since the the patent came into the public domain, so now it's even connected. You can even connect it with whatever other companies make, fake Legos. And so that's one of my last points, is to allow diversions and modifications. So this is a family tree for RepRap. So RepRap is one of the first, or probably the first open source 3D printer. It came out in 2005 in a research lab in the UK. And it had the specificity that it could make its own part. So the rep in RepRap stands for replicable. So it means it reproduces itself. And so you can see the first one on the left, and then it was published, and then there's a lot of other projects that use the same base and then made slight modifications. And so it's the family tree ends around I think it's 5, 6, 7, 8, so around 2010, something like that. So since then, a lot more has happened. So you can imagine the family tree actually growing like crazy. Obviously, not all of these projects, not all of these 3D printers are open source. Some of them are actually very successful companies, maybe like Ultimaker, MakerBot. They're all interesting companies that employ hundreds of people and make millions of dollars. You get the idea. This is called forking, basically, when you use a main project and you make a modification on it. So 8 rules for the bazaar to make better projects. So I'm just going to read through them quickly, but create desire with a clear and forward-looking mission, make organizational boundaries porous, encourage initiatives and minimize friction, turn governance around those who make, set your own rules, make everything transparent, favor systems over products, allow diversions and modifications. So here's another metaphor of what we could call the cathedral and the bazaar. On the left-hand side is like a classic concert. There is people on the stage. They're all following their own path. There's everything is written down. There's one boss that actually drives everything, and the public is standing on the other side, and they listen, clap, listen, clap. On the left-hand side, on the right-hand side is more of a jam. So this could be shown as an example of the bazaar as well, because there is no obvious leader. There is no obvious audience. I mean, there is not such a clear difference between the audience and the players. There is no guidance, but it doesn't mean that they don't have rules. So there's a few questions around when you look at those two pictures. So and some of them can be around, okay, can you have two people jamming within a concert? Can you have someone who's done classical music all his life? Can he go into a bazaar when people ask him to? So for companies, for organizations that are wondering how to basically blend those two together or alternate, go from one to the other, this brings some really interesting questions around roles, competencies, rules, structure, tools, and once again, governance. So that's me here, 45 minutes. These are, wait. I'm going to send you, or Sam is going to send you a questionnaire, maybe if you're interested for me in one of those subjects, that if you want me to talk about it, or should I be? Oh, a lot of people interested in system thinking. Okay, cool. So I don't really have anything planned for. So I don't have slides for this part, but I can get into it. Maybe if you have specific questions about it, don't hesitate. Sam's gonna bring them in. So first of all, maybe I'm not sure if I was clear enough when I talked about it, but yeah, for me, two very good examples of system thinking is Lego and Arduino, but then there is a lot of other systems that you can, once you kind of start to see them around you, it starts to make a lot of sense, but and you start to see them everywhere. But one thing that is interesting around systems is basically it helps people find ways to contribute. So once if you share your base, your structure, it means people are going to be able to add to it a lot more easily. So if you imagine if Lego wanted to be open source, for example, and have people be able to contribute to bring new kits or new parts, basically they can just share their system and be like, okay, so here is the grid we like, here is we use, here is the spacing, here is our basically our ground rules. We just use 10 colors, or we make sure our products can be disassembled or whatever. And then with those rules, with this system, it means people are then able to contribute, or could be able to contribute to it and bring suggest new basically new parts based on it. And that's really what's happening with Arduino. For your mobility projects, I think there's some really interesting things to dig. I mean, I'm not saying you have to, obviously, but I think there is some really interesting things to dig in this space. Because when we talk about systems, we also think about standards. So one of the things that work on that make the web work, for example, is standards. We hardly ever think about it, but there's a lot of people who actually gather into meetings and decide what new emojis are going to come out. So, for example, there's about 290 new emojis coming this year, and this means people had to get together and actually argue and decide and so on, and then agree on a standard. And that's why when you send someone an aubergine, for example, eggplant, he receives an eggplant, or she receives an eggplant on the other side, and it's the same one, even though you're not using the same mobile phone system. So this notion of system and standards, I think, is really interesting, and there is a lot to be done in the mobility space, and even in the urban setting, basically, because there's hardly anything in the urban spacing that is thought around the notion of system. Do you want to throw me a question?
Situation conversée, t'en as une. We're stuck and have ideas. What is the best advice you can give us?
Attends, c'est quoi?
En gros, si on est coincé, qu'on n'a pas d'idée, quel est le meilleur conseil que tu puisses nous donner?
Avec leur, with their, if you feel stuck around your projects, what advice can I give you? I think that's what the question is around. I think that's one of the first thing I talked about around the bazaar, but I think for me one of the main points around on these projects is desire. And so basically, if you're not sure what to work on, I would say find something that you're really interested into. Maybe you like animals, maybe you like holidays, maybe you like adventure, maybe you like games, I don't know. But I think that's really the main point. If you need to find something that you're gonna like working on, then you're gonna have to like spending time doing. And I would say, especially on such it's a short project, there's not much I mean, you can't really go wrong. I mean, obviously you can have a bad grade, I guess, but like no one's going to get hurt. You're not in a business, in a company setting. So I would say go have fun and go for something that you already enjoy and something that you already like, something that you want to dig into, basically, and spend time doing. All right, so maybe I'm gonna wrap it up for this presentation. Just remember, around this idea of bazaar and contribution, we are really only at the beginning. You can take any of those 8 rules that I shared with you. Basically, we're really at the Stone Age on any of those. And this means it's going to change a lot, and it's going to evolve a lot during your your life, or the time you're going to spend working. So you're going to be developing these subjects. So yeah, I would say get into it and start building make us evolve. There's a few questions to get started. I shared a few already, but there is something around balancing the cathedral and the bazaar. I already mentioned it. There's something about the evaluation of contributions. I think this is really one of the things where we're really still very primitive, is when someone contributes, how do you find out if it's actually valuable for the project? It's not because people put thumbs up or whatever that it makes it better than another contribution. So there's really something to dig here. In the same aspect, there's something about value sharing. So I said equally, but it might even have to be equally, but there is something about sharing value between contributors. And that's value in a very general sense. If you think about one of the first projects that I showed you, there is Lego Ideas, which is so crowdsourcing for Lego kits. I'm not sure what is given to people who actually get their kit chosen. It might be money, but I don't know. You'd really have to dig into what makes those people tick and why they actually do it. Like, what are they looking for? Why are they contributing? It might be money, it might be something else, and you need to find ways to activate and share the value produced. Where to start, obviously, so that's like a big one. How to keep the bazaar inclusive? I think this is one of the very important parts, because what makes the bazaar rich is also the diversity of contributors, and you need to find ways to make sure people feel welcome in the bazaar, and that they it's not like a group of friends or like-minded people who work together on the same thing. What commons can you share? So I hardly talked about commons, and it doesn't seem like it's not something that you found interesting, obviously, but I think it's one of the key elements also of the bazaar is what do we keep at the center, and what are the things that we share and that we value. Obviously, in Wikipedia, the commons is the articles produced, but there's a lot of things around. There's discussions around these articles. There's a lot of things happening. And so I would say in your project, always try and find what are the commons, what is the things that are at the center that you can share and that you can value and that you can contribute to, that are going to expand as the project expands. And once again, learn governance, get into governance. I don't know, in this era, we've forgotten how to spend time. We've forgotten how long democracy actually takes. It's not going to the poll and putting your envelope into like a slot. It's about how you get involved in a community, how you reach consensus together. So there's a lot to be learned again in there. And so this is me. Talk 2000 on social networks. And you can see this presentation. So here is the link to the presentation, which is online. Is the one I've used. So it's the exact same. And right under is the link of the presentation on GitHub. If you want to use it for Kit, make changes to it, obviously you're welcome.